Elara Vance had learned the precise shape of being unseen. It was a calculated erosion of her presence within the walls of her family's estate, a house where she had once belonged, but where she now felt like a ghost haunting her own life. As she sat in the drafty library, the scent of beeswax and old parchment clinging to her woolen shawl, she heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots in the hallway. It was a sound that did not belong to her father, whose step had always been a light, scholarly shuffle. These boots belonged to her cousin, Silas Thorne, and they carried the weight of a man who had already decided the house was his. She kept her head down, her fingers moving with practiced precision, as she applied a thin layer of flour paste to the spine of a damaged ledger. Bookbinding was a labor of silence, requiring a stillness of the soul that she had spent years perfecting. The grain of the leather, the resistance of the linen thread, the subtle humidity of the air. These were the variables she could control. Outside this room, however, the world was shifting in ways she could not arrest. Her father had been dead for only a fortnight, yet the air in the house had already grown clinical and cold, as if the very stones were preparing to reject her presence. The door creaked open, admitting a draught that made the candle flame dance in a frantic arc. Elara did not look up. She waited for the silence to be broken, knowing that in the hierarchy of this house, she was now little more than furniture that had outlived its usefulness. Silas did not speak at first. He simply stood there, his presence a dark blot against the elegant damask wallpaper. He was a man of sharp angles and sharper intentions, his eyes always scanning for a weakness in a ledger or a convenient loophole in a deed. "It is a pity about the damp, Elara," Silas said, his voice as dry as the parchment she held. "I fear the estate cannot sustain the upkeep of such a large house any longer, especially not with the debts your father saw fit to accumulate in his pursuit of rare manuscripts." Elara's hand faltered for a fraction of a second, the bone folder pressing a jagged line into the leather. "My father was a scholar, Silas. He was the steward of this family's history. Every debt was an investment in the preservation of our name." Silas stepped closer, the smell of expensive tobacco and rain-dampened wool preceding him like a threat. "History is a luxury for those who can afford the interest," he countered, his tone devoid of any familial warmth. "The bank does not accept lineage as collateral. I have spent the last week with the solicitors in London. The codicil in your father's will is specific. Since there is no male heir, the title passes to me, as does the responsibility for the outstanding arrears." He placed a heavy cream-colored envelope on the workbench right next to her pot of paste. It was a calculated insult, a document of displacement laid among the tools of her survival. Elara looked at it, the black wax seal appearing like a drop of dried blood. "You are casting me out," she murmured, her voice steady despite the cold settling in her chest. "I am settling the accounts, Elara. There is a difference. You have 48 hours to remove your personal effects. I have already arranged for a carriage to take you to the village. Perhaps one of the local shops has need of a woman who knows her way around a needle and thread." He turned to leave, pausing only to look at the half-bound ledger on the table. "Leave the records. They are part of the estate now." When the door clicked shut, the silence that followed was hollow, like the echoing quiet of a tomb. Elara reached out and touched the envelope. Her fingers were stained with ink and calloused from years of pulling thread through stubborn hide, the marks of a woman who understood the hidden architecture of her world. Silas saw only a penniless cousin, a nuisance to be cleared away. He did not see the mind that had balanced her father's books for a decade, nor the resilience forged in the shadows of the library. She did not cry. Grief was a luxury she could no longer afford. Instead, she began to pack. She did not reach for fine sarsenet dresses or silver hairbrushes. She gathered her binding tools, the brass-backed saw, the sewing frame, the iron presses. She took her father's small traveling desk and a single satchel of clothing. By the time the first grey light of dawn touched the frost-covered windows, Elara Vance was no longer a daughter of the estate. She was a woman, with nowhere left to go, standing on the threshold of a world that had forgotten she existed. The rain began as she reached the edge of the lands, a relentless, icy deluge that soaked through her heavy cloak within minutes. The village offered no sanctuary. Silas had made sure to spread word of the family's shameful debts, and the doors that might once have opened for her remained firmly shut. She walked for hours, her boots churning the mud of the Welsh border roads. The landscape here was ancient and unforgiving, a place of limestone ridges and hidden valleys where the wind screamed through the trees like a wounded animal. By late afternoon, The cold had moved past her skin and into her marrow. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and the weight of the satchel felt like a leaden yoke across her shoulders. Driven by a desperate need to find any shelter from the worsening gale, she strayed far from the main road. It was through a gap in the tangled canopy of the woods that she saw it, a jagged silhouette of stone rising against the roiling purple of the storm-tossed sky. It was Castle Celyn. She had heard the stories, whispers of a forgotten fortress on the border, a place cursed by its history, and abandoned by the Earls of Oakhaven generations ago. It was said to be a ruin, a hollow shell where the only residents were the ravens. But as Elara stumbled toward the massive iron-studded gates, she saw not a curse, but a fortress. The grey stone walls were choked with ivy, and the battlements were crumbling, but the structure possessed a formidable, brooding strength. The main gates were rusted shut, the chains thick with years of neglect. Elara moved along the perimeter wall, her hands trailing over the rough, moss-covered limestone. She felt the vibration of the wind against the rock, the castle standing firm, while the rest of the world seemed to be dissolving in the rain. Near the base of the west tower, she found a small postern door, half hidden behind a dense thicket of brambles. She pulled at the thorns, her palms bleeding, the sharp stings a distant sensation, compared to the numbness in her feet. The wood of the door was oak, reinforced with iron straps that had turned the color of dried earth. It was locked, but the frame had shifted with the settler foundation over centuries. Elara braced her shoulder against the wood and pushed. The door groaned, a long, low sound that echoed through the trees, but it did not budge. She closed her eyes, the rain lashing her face. She thought of her father's library, now filled with Silas's arrogant voice. A surge of quiet cold fury rose within her, a refusal to be erased. She threw her weight against the door one more time, not with desperation, but with the focused intent of a woman claiming her right to exist. With a violent crack, the iron bolt sheared through the rotted wood of the frame. The door swung inward, and Elara tumbled into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The air inside was still, and smelled of dust, ancient stone, and the faint metallic tang of dampness. She lay on the floor for a moment, listening to the muffled roar of the storm outside. Here, the wind could not reach her. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of centuries. It possessed the distinct chill of a place that had been waiting for someone to arrive. She reached into her satchel and found her tinderbox, her fingers trembling as she struck the flint. The first spark died, but the second caught the dry wick of a small candle stub. As the flame grew, the shadows receded, revealing a vaulted stone passageway. The floor was covered in a carpet of fine grey dust, undisturbed by anything but the occasional trail of a field mouse. Elara stood up, holding the candle high. She began to walk, her footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. The castle felt larger than it had from the outside, a labyrinth of interconnected halls and spiraling stairs that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. She found herself in a great kitchen, the hearth large enough to roast an ox, its blackened chimney reaching up into the throat of the castle. Beyond, she discovered a dining hall where the long oak tables remained in place. Though the tapestries on the walls had been reduced to tattered ribbons, the castle had not been ransacked, it had simply been put to sleep. She climbed a set of stone stairs, her legs aching with every step, until she reached a heavy set of double doors on the second floor. She pushed them open and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. It was the library. Unlike the rest of the castle, which felt hollow and skeletal, the library felt full. Thousands of volumes lined the walls, their leather spines glinting in the weak candlelight. There were rolling ladders, heavy mahogany desks, and an enormous stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. The ceiling was a masterpiece of carved oak, though a dark stain in the corner suggested a leak in the roof. Elara walked toward the center of the room, her hand reaching out to touch the edge of a desk. A thick layer of dust came away on her fingers, but beneath it the wood was smooth and cold. She set her candle on the desk and looked at her hands. They were bruised, bloodied, and stained with the mud of her journey, but they were still the hands of a craftsman. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small dry cloth, beginning to wipe the dust from the surface of the mahogany. It was a small act, a single gesture of restoration, but as the wood began to shine under the candlelight, the darkness of the castle seemed to pull back just a little. She was 23 years old, she was penniless, and she was a trespasser in a forgotten fortress. But as the rain continued to lash against the high arched windows, Elara Vance sat down in the high-backed chair and closed her eyes. She was no longer looking for a way out. She was listening for the silent endurance of the stone, and for the first time in a fortnight, she felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. The morning arrived not with the warmth of the sun, but with a thin, clinical grey light that filtered through the high windows of the library. It was the colour of unpolished pewter, cold and uncompromising, casting long, stark shadows across the mahogany shelves. Elara Vance woke in the high-backed chair, her neck stiff and her breath visible in the frigid air of the room. The small fire she had coaxed into life the night before had long since collapsed into a heap of pale, skeletal ash, offering no resistance to the damp chill of the Welsh border. She did not move immediately. Instead, she spent a long moment mapping the particular resonance of the quiet. It was a skill she had perfected during her years of isolation in her own home. It was different here than it had been at the Vance estate. There, the silence had been heavy with the expectations of the dead and the rapacious greed of the living. Here, at Castle Celyn, the silence was simply the breath of the stone, old, indifferent, and strangely welcoming. It felt like a fortress that had forgotten how to be a home, waiting for someone to remind it of its own foundation. She stood up, her joints protesting the dampness that had seeped into the very marrow of the house. Hunger was no longer a distant thought, but a sharp, rhythmic demand. She gathered her satchel and made her way back down the spiraling stone stairs toward the great kitchen she had glimpsed in the dark. In the daylight, the room was a cavern of soot and shadows. The massive hearth, capable of holding a whole oak log, was filled with the debris of decades, fallen mortar, abandoned bird nests, and the fine, gritty dust of limestone erosion. Elara did not recoil from the mess. She recognized the deep anatomy of the estate, the way a structure required care to remain a sanctuary. She set her satchel on a scarred butcher's block and rolled up her sleeves, her ink-stained fingers, finding purchase on a heavy iron shovel, leaned against the damp wall. The work was grueling. Each movement required a deliberate application of strength that left her muscles trembling. But there was a profound dignity in the manual labor. She cleared the hearth, the rhythmic scrape of iron against stone becoming a heartbeat for the empty room. Her hands, already calloused from years of bookbinding and ledger work, grew dark with soot, but she felt a strange satisfaction in the grime. She found a stash of dry wood in a secondary pantry, ancient cedar and birch that had miraculously been spared the rot of the relentless Welsh rain. As the first tendrils of wood smoke began to rise into the throat of the chimney, a sound broke the isolation of her task. It was not the wind nor the scuttle of a mouse. It was the distinct, rhythmic tap of a cane against the flagstone floor of the passageway. Elara froze, the shovel still in her hand. She did not turn toward the door immediately. She watched the shadow that lengthened across the threshold. It was a sharp, narrow silhouette that suggested a person who had spent a lifetime navigating narrow spaces and even narrower social expectations. "You've a better hand with a hearth than the last few the Earl sent to survey this place," a voice rasped. It was a voice like dry leaves skittering over pavement, pragmatic, sharp, and entirely devoid of fear. Elara turned slowly. Standing in the doorway was Martha Halloway. She was a woman of indeterminate age, her face a map of deep-set lines and her eyes as bright and hard as polished jet. She wore a heavy cloak of boiled wool and a cap that had seen better decades, but she held herself with the quiet authority of a woman who owned every shadow she stood in. "I was not aware the castle was occupied," Elara said, her voice steady. She did not apologize for her presence. In the hierarchy of ruins, she felt her labor had earned her a seat at the fire. Martha stepped into the light, her gaze sweeping over the clean hearth and the neatly stacked wood with a keen, clinical eye. "Occupied is a strong word for a pile of rocks waiting for the mountain to reclaim it. I am Martha Halloway. I was the housekeeper here when the Oakhaven line still had the sense to breathe the air of their own lands. Now I simply watch the stone. And who might you be, with your ink-stained hands and your father's eyes?" Elara felt a jolt of recognition. "I am Elara Vance. My father was a collector of histories. If he had eyes like mine, it was because he spent too much time looking for truths in the margins of old books." Martha walked toward the fire, the heat drawing a faint scent of damp wool and dried lavender from her cloak. She didn't ask how Elara had come to be there, nor why a woman of her carriage was shoveling ash in a forgotten fortress. "Your father came here once 20 years ago," Martha murmured, her eyes fixed on the growing flame. "He didn't look at the battlements or the gold leaf in the chapel. He went straight for the library. Said the true strength of a house isn't in its walls, but in its ledgers. You look like you've come for the same thing." Elara replied with an honesty that felt sharp in the quiet room. "I have nowhere else to go. Silas Thorne has taken the estate. He sees only the debt, not the legacy." Martha gave a dry, hacking laugh. Silas Thorne is a man who would weigh his own mother's soul to see if there was a profit in the lead of her coffin. He's been circling these lands like a hawk over a limping rabbit. He thinks the Earl is dead or indifferent enough to let him claim the border right. The housekeeper paused, looking Elara directly in the eye. "The kitchen is yours for the morning, girl, but the roof over the library is failing. If you mean to stay, you'd best learn to mend more than just a fire." The transition from the warmth of the kitchen to the cold heights of the library was a physical blow. Martha had left as quietly as she had arrived, leaving behind a small loaf of dark bread and a wedge of hard cheese, a silent covenant of shelter. Elara ate as she worked, her mind already calculating the physics of the repair needed. The dark stain she had noticed the previous night was worse in the daylight. Rain was weeping from a gap in the lead-lined roof, tracing a slow, destructive path down a carved oak pillar. It was a calculated insult of time against art. Elara found a set of maintenance tools in a cedar chest near the belfry stairs, heavy brass-backed saws, iron pry bars, and rolls of lead flashing that had grown dull with age. She did not hesitate. She climbed the rolling ladder, her boots steady on the rungs as she ascended into the shadows of the vaulted ceiling. The height did not frighten her. She had spent her childhood reaching for the highest shelves of her father's collection. The labor was meticulous. She had to scrape away the rotted mortar with a small chisel, her hands cramping in the biting cold. She fit a new piece of lead over the breach, the metal heavy and cold against her palms. As she hammered the edges into place, the sound echoing through the hollow library, she felt a strange sense of restoration. She was not just fixing a roof, she was mending a boundary. Every strike of the hammer was a refusal to let the world dissolve into Welsh mist. She was finishing the seal when she heard the sound. It was the distant, unmistakable rattle of carriage wheels on the overgrown gravel. Elara froze, her hand still resting on the cold lead of the roof. She looked through a high, narrow window that overlooked the valley. A black carriage, polished to a mirror sheen that looked obscene against the wild, unkempt green of the woods, was pulling up to the rusted gates. The crest on the door was one she knew too well. The Thorne family griffin. Silas had arrived. He did not wait for his footman to open the door. He stepped out onto the mud, his tall, lean frame encased in a coat of finest superfine wool that seemed to repel the dampness of the air. He stood at the gates with a surveyor, a man in a sturdy canvas coat who carried a brass transit. Silas's gaze raked over the ivy-choked walls of Castle Celyn with a clinical, predatory intensity. "It is an eyesore." Silas's voice drifted up, carried by the draft. "A legal ghost that complicates the boundary. The Earl has not responded to my inquiries in 3 years. By the laws of neglect, the stone belongs to the land, and the land belongs to whoever can manage the arrears." The surveyor adjusted his transit, looking at the massive stone blocks. "The foundation is remarkably deep, sir. It would take a great deal of effort to displace it." Silas countered, his tone hardening with an arrogance that made Elara's skin crawl. "The foundation is a nuisance. Once I have the deed finalized, I intended to have the entire pile raised. The limestone will be crushed for the new road and the timber sold for scrap. There is no value in a ruin that produces no rent. We begin the demolition assessment at the first of the month." Elara leaned against the cold stone, her fingers digging into the mortar she had just mended. The social coldness of his regard was a physical weight, a threat to the only sanctuary she had left. He saw only the scrap value of the wood and the stone. He did not see the thousands of books or the woman who had just spent 4 hours mending the framework of the house. She watched him turn back toward his carriage, his movements full of the arrogant certainty of a man who believed that everything in the world had a price. As the carriage pulled away, the silence returned to the castle, but it was no longer the silence of endurance. It was the silence of a countdown. Elara looked back at the library. The leak was stopped. The wood was dry. The secret she was looking for, the one Martha had hinted at, the one her father had glimpsed 20 years ago, was here, buried somewhere in the dust and the ink. She had less than a fortnight before Silas returned with the tools of destruction. She did not have time for grief, and she did not have time for fear. She had only the labor of the search. She walked to the center of the room and picked up a single heavy ledger from the nearest desk. The leather was cracked, and the scent of old dust was thick, but as she opened the cover, her ink-stained fingers felt a familiar tingle. She was no longer just a trespasser. She was the steward of a failing fortress, and she would find the truth of this place before the first stone was turned to dust. She sat down, the weight of the book a comfort in her lap, and began to read as the rain began to fall again. For now, the library was dry. For now, she was safe. But the real battle for Castle Celyn was only just beginning. The ink on the ledger was long dry, the entries dating back to a time before the turn of the century, yet Elara Vance traced the elegant copperplate script with a reverence that bordered on the religious. She had spent the last 3 hours immersed in the Oakhaven perpetuity, her mind weaving through the complex tapestry of land grants, tithes, and annuities that defined the estate's history. It was a language she understood, a world where every decimal point represented a life lived, and every debt was a heavy stone in the wall of a family's legacy. The library was silent, save for the rhythmic scratching of a mouse behind the wainscoting and the distant, muffled sigh of the wind through the battlements. It was a silence so profound that she could hear the precise cadence of her own breathing, a small, fragile sound against the weight of the thousands of volumes that stood witness to her labor. She did not hear the footsteps at first. In a house of stone and shadow, sound moved in deceptive ways, often trapped in the thick tapestries or swallowed by the vaulted ceilings. Instead, she felt the shift in the room's temperature, a sudden, subtle cooling that made the hair on her arms stand on end. She did not look up immediately. She finished the line she was reading, her finger resting on a particular entry concerning a crown grant from 1745. Only then did she turn her head, her gaze traveling from the pool of candlelight on the desk toward the dark maw of the west wing doorway. Arthur Penhaligon stood there, framed by the shadows of the arched entrance. He was tall, his silhouette lean and imposing in a frock coat of charcoal wool that seemed to absorb the meager light. He did not move, and for a heartbeat Elara thought he might be another ghost of the castle, a remnant of the Oakhaven line that had refused to depart. But then the light from her single candle caught the glint of his eyes, searching, intelligent, and burdened by a weariness that went deeper than bone. As he stepped forward into the periphery of the light, she saw the scar. It was a thin, jagged line that ran from his temple down to the edge of his jaw, a permanent record of a violence he had survived but never truly escaped. "You have been busy, Miss Vance," Arthur said. His voice was a low baritone, possessing the texture of velvet stretched over iron. It was not the voice of a trespasser, but of a man who owned the very air he breathed. Elara stood, her movements controlled and elegant, despite the soot that still clung to her cuffs. She did not curtsy. In the isolation of Castle Celyn, social protocols felt like discarded husks. "I was not aware the Earl of Oakhaven entertained visitors in the library," she replied, her voice steady. "Though I suppose entertained is perhaps the wrong word for a man who prefers the company of dust and silence." Arthur Penhaligon moved closer, his gaze dropping to the open ledger on the desk. He did not look at her face. He looked at her hands. He saw the ink stains on her fingertips and the faint, red marks of her recent labor on the roof. "Martha Halloway told me someone had found a way through the postern door," he murmured. She did not mention that the intruder possessed the soul of a bookbinder and the hands of a mason. Most who find themselves at these gates seek only to steal the lead from the gutters or the silver from the chapel. "I seek only a dry place to exist, Arthur," Elara said, her tone softening but remaining firm, and it seemed a pity to let the Oakhaven history dissolve in the rain. "Your roof was weeping. I merely offered it a handkerchief." Arthur reached out, his long, scarred fingers hovering over the parchment. He did not touch the book as if he feared his own presence might contaminate the record. "My history is a ledger of loss, Miss Vance. My father spent his final years trying to sell the very stones beneath our feet to pay for debts he didn't understand. I am the last of a line that has forgotten how to be anything but a memory. You are wasting your competence on a ruin that has already accepted its fate." "A house only dies when the people inside it stop listening to its bones," Elara countered, stepping around the desk to face him. The proximity revealed the scent of him: cedarwood, old leather, and a hint of wood smoke. "Silas Thorne is at your gates with a surveyor. He intends to raise this structure for road material. He believes that because you have remained silent, you have ceased to exist. I am not mending the roof for your sake, Arthur. I am mending it because the truth of this perpetuity deserves better than to be crushed into gravel." Arthur Penhaligon looked at her then, his eyes locking onto hers with a sudden, startling intensity. It was the first time in years he had truly seen another person, and the sensation seemed to unnerve him. He saw the quiet resilience in her posture and the intellectual fire in her gaze. A woman who had been shamed by her own kin but refused to be diminished. "Silas Thorne is a persistent shadow," Arthur murmured, a shadow of a grimace crossing his features. "But he is a man of law, and the law is often a cold, unyielding thing when it comes to an empty house." "Then we must give the house a voice," Elara said. "The records are incomplete. There are gaps in the sequence of the Oakhaven grants that do not align with the debts Silas claims. If I can find the missing ledger, the one my father came here to see 20 years ago, I might find the evidence to halt the demolition. But I cannot do it if you continue to hide in the West Wing, waiting for the walls to fall." Arthur did not answer immediately. He turned away, his gaze retreating to the dark shelves that climbed toward the ceiling. "I have found that silence is the only armor that doesn't rust," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He began to walk back toward the shadows, his limp slight but noticeable. "Mend what you can, Miss Vance, but do not expect the stone to thank you." He vanished into the darkness as silently as he had appeared, leaving Elara alone with the candle and the weight of a secret she had yet to uncover. The peace of the library was shattered 4 nights later. It began with a change in the air, a heavy, electric stillness that made the very atmosphere feel like a coiled spring. By midnight, the Welsh border was being lashed by a storm that felt personal in its ferocity. The wind screamed through the battlements of Castle Celyn, a sound like 1,000 lamenting voices, and the rain struck the high windows with the force of thrown gravel. Elara Vance was in the library, her hands trembling as she tried to secure the heavy shutters when she heard the sound. It was not the wind, it was a deep, guttural groan that seemed to rise from the very foundation of the castle. It was the sound of earth shifting and ancient Mortimer failing under the weight of the saturation. She grabbed her candle, but a sudden gust from the chimney extinguished the flame, plunging her into a darkness so absolute she felt she was drowning. "The cellar!" a voice shouted over the roar of the gale. A hand gripped her arm, firm and protective. It was Arthur Penhaligon. In the flashes of lightning that illuminated the room through the cracks in the shutters, his face was a mask of grim determination. "The south foundation is washing out. If the main pillar shifts, the library floor will collapse into the vaults." They moved together through the darkness, their steps guided by Arthur's intimate knowledge of the castle's anatomy. The air in the lower passageways was thick with the scent of wet earth and the metallic tang of old iron. When they reached the foundation level, the sight was terrifying. Water was geysering through a breach in the limestone blocks, the force of it carving a channel through the dirt floor. The massive oak beam that supported the library above was beginning to tilt, the wood screaming under the unnatural strain. "We have to brace it," Elara cried, her voice barely audible over the thunder. She did not wait for instructions. She saw the stack of timber and the iron pry bars she had found in the cedar chest days before. "The leverage. If we can wedge the lead flashing and the stone blocks, we can stop the shift until the water recedes." For the next 3 hours, there was no earl and no disinherited cousin. There were only 2 people fighting for the survival of a shared sanctuary. Arthur Penhaligon used his superior strength to drive the iron bars beneath the tilting beam, his muscles straining against the superfine wool of his coat until the seams groaned. Elara moved with a clinical precision, her ink-stained fingers slick with mud as she positioned the limestone wedges and the lead sheets to create a watertight seal against the encroaching earth. The labor was brutal and primitive. They worked in a cramped, dark space where the only light came from a single lantern hung on a rusted hook. Every time the castle groaned, Elara felt the vibration in her own bones, a physical manifestation of the fragility of their world. Arthur stood beside her, his body a shield against the spray of the water, his presence offering a quiet, steadfast heat in the cold damp of the cellar. There was no room for sideways dialogue now. There was only the rhythmic, coordinated movement of their bodies and the shared desperation of the task. As Hay hammered the final wedge into place, the earth seemed to settle with a heavy, wet thud. The groaning of the timber ceased, replaced by the steady receding drum of the rain. They stood in the mud, exhausted and covered in the grime of the earth, their breath coming in ragged, synchronized gasps. Arthur looked at Elara, his gaze tracing the streaks of soot on her forehead and the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. He saw not a penniless woman, but the cornerstone of the house, the only person who had dared to stand between the castle and its own destruction. "You saved it," Arthur whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't permitted himself in a decade. "You saved the bones of the thing." Elara wiped a smear of mud from her cheek, her hands shaking from the exertion. She looked down at the floor, where the earth had shifted. A section of the flagstone near the central pillar had cracked open, revealing not more dirt, but the corner of something hard and metallic buried deep within the foundation. It was a lead casket, its surface dull and grey, appearing like a seed that had been waiting for the right storm to sprout. "It wasn't just the water, Arthur," Elara said, her voice hushed with a sudden, intuitive certainty. "The house shifted because it wanted us to see." She reached down, her fingers brushing the cold, heavy metal of the casket. This was the secret her father had glimpsed. The reason Silas Thorne was so desperate to raise the stones before the truth could be unearthed. Arthur knelt beside her, his hand covering hers on the lid of the box. The storm was still raging outside, but inside the deep quiet of the foundation, the silence had changed. It was no longer the temperature of neglect. It was the unmistakable atmosphere of a revelation. Arthur Penhaligon reached out and slowly extinguished the lantern, the click of the metal latch, sounding like a period at the end of a long, difficult sentence. They sat in the dark together, the weight of the secret between them, while the castle stood firm against the retreating wind. Castle Celyn was no longer just a ruin. It was a map, and they had finally found the first coordinate. "Tell me, as you listen to the rain tonight, have you ever found that the greatest secrets are hidden not in the heights of our success, but in the foundations of our struggles? From which corner of the world are you witnessing this restoration? Share your sanctuary with me below." The darkness in the foundation level of Castle Celyn was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical weight, thick with the scent of wet limestone and the ancient metallic breath of the earth. For a long moment, Elara Vance did not move, her bare, blistered hand resting upon the cold, leaden surface of the casket she had just unearthed from the shifting soil. Beside her, she could hear the measured, rhythmic breathing of Arthur Penhaligon, the Earl of Oakhaven. His presence in the shadows felt like a living shield against the chaos of the receding storm. The water that had threatened to swallow the library's foundation now whispered in a series of diminishing trickles, a sound like 1,000 secrets retreating into the cracks of the deep stone. Ella felt the coarse grit of the silt beneath her fingernails and the dampness of her woolen skirts clinging to her knees. Yet her focus was narrowed entirely to the object beneath her palm. It was the physical shape of a turning point. Arthur reached out into the gloom, his hand steady as he struck a fresh match against the wall. The small, sulphurous spark flared into life, illuminating the sharp angles of his face and the jagged line of the scar that marked his history. He touched the flame to the wick of the brass lantern. As the amber glow expanded, the cellar transformed instantly from a tomb into a workshop. The light glinted sharply off the wet iron pry bars and the grey, oxidized surface of the buried casket. It was perhaps 12 inches long, reinforced with bands of rusted iron that had bonded with the soft lead over decades of burial in the damp Welsh soil. "It has been waiting a long time, Miss Vance," Arthur murmured, his voice echoing softly against the low, vaulted ceiling. He moved with a deliberate, slow grace, his limp more pronounced after the hours of physical strain. He knelt beside her on the uneven floor, the fine wool of his ruined frock coat brushing against the mud-slicked flagstones. He did not reach for the box himself. He waited, acknowledging in silence that the discovery belonged to the woman who had refused to let his house fall. Elara picked up a small iron chisel, her fingers moving with the precise, practiced economy of a bookbinder. She began to scrape away the heavy accumulation of mineral deposits and dried silt from the seal of the casket. It was a labor of extreme patience, the rhythmic click-clink of metal against lead, sounding like the steady pulse of a clock marking the end of an era. She worked with a clinical focus, her mind mapping the structural weaknesses of the iron oxidation. She was not merely opening a box, she was performing a meticulous restoration of the truth. "My father spoke of a missing link in the Oakhaven perpetuity," she said, her voice low and remarkably steady. He believed that the massive debts recorded in the London ledgers did not match the physical reality of this estate's output. He spent his life listening for the water, not the wheel. Arthur watched her, his gaze fixated entirely on the competence of her calloused hands. He saw the way she handled the heavy tools, not with the clumsy desperation of a treasure hunter, but with the quiet reverence of a steward. "The wheel has been broken for a generation," he replied, his eyes dark with a flickering hope he actively tried to suppress. "My father preferred the comfort of a lie to the grueling labor of a truth. He allowed men like Silas Thorne to manage the accounts, because the silence was easier than the confrontation. He didn't realize that silence, when left untended, eventually becomes a cage. With a sharp, decisive crack, the rusted iron bands finally gave way. Elara braced her shoulder and prized the heavy lid upward. The metal groaned, a long, protesting sound that seemed to carry the sheer weight of decades. As the lid fell back against the silt, a faint, sweet scent drifted upward. Not of decay, but of cedarwood and pure beeswax. Inside, wrapped tightly in a heavy oil-treated silk, lay a bundle of vellum parchments and a small set of leather-bound volumes that shimmered faintly with threads of real silver. They did not speak. The gravity of the moment demanded a stillness, so absolute it felt like the world itself had held its breath. Elara reached into the box, her touch feather-light as she lifted the heavy bundle. She led the way back up the spiraling stone stairs, holding the lantern high, her boots sounding a hollow, rhythmic beat against the limestone. They returned to the library, the sanctuary she had painstakingly mended with her own hands. The air here was drier now, the familiar scent of old paper and wood smoke a profoundly welcome embrace. She placed the silk-wrapped bundle on the central mahogany desk, right beneath the pool of light from the tall silver candelabra. Arthur stood across from her, his hands gripped tightly behind his back, his posture rigid as he watched her unfold the silk. He looked like a man standing before a firing squad, or perhaps a man awaiting an unexpected resurrection. Elara smoothed the first heavy parchment flat. It was the original royal land grant for Castle Celyn and the surrounding Oakhaven lands, bearing a massive wax seal that carried the undeniable weight of the Crown's historic authority. The ink was a deep midnight black, the calligraphy a masterpiece of formal precision. "This is the foundation," Elara whispered, her eyes scanning the legal Latin with a speed born of years of accounting work. "But look here, Arthur. Look at the signatures." She moved to the small set of leather-bound volumes, the hidden accounts. These were the real records, the secret buried inside that had cost her father his peace of mind. As she carefully turned the pages, the staggering story of a massive calculated deception began to emerge from the margins. It was not merely a record of yields and tithes. It was a private ledger of the family's true holdings, maintained in secret by the Earls of Oakhaven to protect the perpetuity from the predations of those who viewed the estate as a carcass to be picked clean. Arthur leaned heavily over the desk, his breath hitching as he read the specific entries from 18 years ago, the very year Silas Thorne had first taken over the management of the Vance estate and the Oakhaven border rights. "These figures," Arthur said, his finger trembling slightly as he pointed to a column of annuities. "They have been systematically altered in the public record. The debt Silas claims I owe. It was paid in full by my grandfather. The interest was a complete fabrication. He has been collecting a double tithe for nearly 2 decades. Elara flipped to the back of the final ledger, where a single folded letter had been tucked into a hidden pocket in the binding. She opened it, the high-quality paper crisp and smelling faintly of lavender. It was written in her father's distinct hand, dated only weeks before his death. "He found it," Elara murmured, a single tear tracing a clean path through the soot on her cheek. "He found the undeniable evidence of the forgery. Silas Thorne didn't just cast me out because of a debt. He cast me out because he knew I was the only one who could read the hidden architecture of these books. He knew that if I stayed, I would eventually find the lead casket." The letter was a detailed account of the massive theft. Silas had not only falsified the debts, he had entirely forged the codicil of the Vance will, stripping Elara of her rightful inheritance, to ensure she would never have the legal standing to challenge his management of the Oakhaven perpetuity. The worthless castle he had allowed her to find shelter in was, by the original royal grant, the legal cornerstone of the entire estate's defense. If the castle was razed, the land would revert to the debt holders, which, through his complex forgeries, Silas had positioned himself to become. Arthur Penhaligon straightened his back, the heavy weariness that had defined his silhouette for years suddenly replaced by a cold, crystalline fury. He looked at the historical documents, then directly at Elara. For the first time, he did not look away. He saw the brilliant woman who had stood in the rain, who had skillfully mended his roof, and who had prized the absolute truth from the very earth beneath his feet. He thought he could bury the legacy in the mud, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet rasp. He thought the silence of this ruin would be his greatest ally. He underestimated the endurance of stone, Elara replied, her fingers resting gently on the silver-threaded ledger. and he forgot that a house only stays silent until someone knows how to listen. We must send for Benjamin Finchley. These documents require the eye of a meticulous lawyer who values the precision of a deed over the false status of the claimant. She looked down at her own hands, bruised outwards, severely ink-stained, and calloused from a month of brutal labor. They were no longer the trembling hands of a ghost or a penniless, discarded cousin. They were the capable hands of the woman who firmly held the keys to the kingdom. Silas Thorne had given her 48 hours to pack her things, believing she would disappear forever into the grey Welsh mist. Instead, she had found an ancient fortress, and inside that fortress, she had found the perfect weapon that would entirely dismantle his empire of lies. Arthur stepped slowly around the massive desk, stopping just inches from her. The delicate dynamic between them had shifted again. It was no longer the silence of two strangers in a ruin, but the unbreakable bond of two allies in a war. He did not reach out to touch her, but he bowed his head, a deeply formal gesture of profound, wordless respect. "You have mended far more than the roof, Elara Vance," he whispered softly into the quiet room. "You have restored the spirit of a man who had entirely forgotten he had one." Elara looked up at the high, beautifully carved cedar ceiling of the library. The violent rain had finally ceased, and the very first light of a new dawn was beginning to touch the highest leaded window, turning the grey glass into a brilliant sheet of gold. The desperate battle for Castle Celyn was no longer a frantic defense. It was a steady march toward absolute justice. Silas Thorne would return at the first of the month with his arrogant surveyors and his heavy demolition tools. But he would find that the ruin was no longer empty. He would find that the ancient cornerstone had been perfectly reset, and that the quiet woman he had tried to erase was now the one who firmly held the ledger of his soul. As you sit in the quiet of your own home tonight, have you ever realized that the truths we most fear to lose are often the ones we have been standing on all along? Where in your life is there a ruin that is actually a strong foundation waiting patiently to be found? From which corner of the world are you listening to this unfolding restoration tonight? Share your quiet sanctuary with me below. The morning that followed the discovery of the lit casket was filled with a brittle, crystalline clarity. The storm had left behind a world scrubbed clean, the air smelling of ozone and wet earth, while the light that poured through the library windows possessed a sharp, unforgiving quality that highlighted every grain of dust on the mahogany shelves. Elara Vance sat at the central desk, her hands finally washed of the cellar's grime, but still bearing the deep purple bruises of her labor, a map of her resilience written in the dark ink of fatigue. She watched as a small, black-clad figure emerged from the morning mist at the edge of the woods, navigating the overgrown carriage path with a slow, meticulous gait. It was Benjamin Finchley. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and an umbrella that he used as a walking stick, his presence a stark, clinical intrusion upon the wild, untended landscape of Castle Celyn. When the lawyer entered the library, he did not immediately speak. He stood for a moment in the center of the room, his keen eyes cataloguing the restoration Elara had achieved. The mended roof, the polished wood, the absence of the pervasive damp that usually defined such ruins. He was a man who lived by the precision of the law, his face a map of carefully curated neutrality that hid a lifetime of secrets. He placed his briefcase on the desk and reached into his waistcoat for a pair of silver-rimmed spectacles, his movements as rhythmic and predictable as a ticking clock in an empty room. "I received your messenger, Miss Vance," Benjamin Finchley said, his voice a dry, precise rasp that seemed to echo the rustle of old parchment. "And the Earl's summons, I must admit. I did not expect to find this house breathing again. Most of my colleagues in London consider Castle Celyn to be little more than a legal abstraction, a ghost in the Oakhaven perpetuity. They spoke of it as a pile of stones awaiting the final breath of decay." Elara stood, her posture as straight and unyielding as the carved oak pillars that supported the ceiling. "The house has stopped holding its breath, Mr. Finchley. We have found the records that were never meant to see the light of day. They were buried beneath the south foundation, placed there by an ancestor who knew that truth is the only stone that does not erode with time." She gestured toward the newly recovered evidence and the royal land grant, the vellum glowing faintly in the morning light. Finchley's neutrality faltered for a fraction of a second as his gaze fell upon the documents. He approached the desk with the cautious reverence of a priest approaching an altar, his gloved fingers trembling slightly. He did not touch them at first. He pulled a magnifying glass from his case and began a clinical examination of the seals and the ink, checking the watermark and the weight of the paper. The library fell into a deep, heavy silence, the stifling weight of a courtroom awaiting a verdict. For nearly an hour, the only sound was the rustle of parchment and the occasional click of the lawyer's spectacles against his magnifying glass. Elara watched him, her mind mapping the social weight of every entry he scrutinized. It was a display of quiet, devastating professional mastery. The slow, methodical dismantling of a complex fraud through the simple application of logic and historical evidence. She felt the weight of her father's legacy in the room, the years of quiet study and ledger-keeping that had prepared her for this precise moment of reckoning. "It is as you suspected, Miss Vance," Finchley finally said, his voice dropping to a whisper of profound gravity. "The deception is not merely a matter of greed. It is a systemic erasure of your family's standing. These private ledgers prove that the debt was settled in perpetuity decades ago. Silas Thorne has been operating a double-entry system for 18 years. He has systematically collected double tithes from the tenantry, manufacturing a liability that does not exist, using the fabricated interest to slowly consume the Vance estate. He has used the perceived decay of this castle to mask his industry of theft." Elara felt a cold, sharp clarity settle in her chest. It was not merely that she had been poor, or that she was a woman without a champion in a world of men. It was that she was competent. She realized then that her exile from her family home had been a premeditated act of social excision. Silas had not cast her out because he found her worthless. He had cast her out because she was the only one who possessed the eyes to see the shape of his crime. Her skill with a ledger and her intelligence had turned up true sins in his house. Arthur Penhaligon emerged from the shadows of the west wing, his silhouette lean and imposing in the morning light. He had traded his ruined frock coat for a simpler garment of dark wool, but the authority in his bearing had been entirely restored. He stopped beside Elara, his presence a silent anchor in the room, his eyes fixed on the evidence of the theft. "Then the law is on our side, Benjamin?" Arthur asked, his voice possessing a new crystalline edge that cut through the silence. Finchley looked up, his expression uncharacteristically grim, the lines of his face deepened by the weight of the revelation. "The law is a tool, my lord. In the hands of a craftsman it builds. In the hands of a man like Silas Thorne, it is a weapon used to bludgeon the vulnerable. You have the evidence of his forgeries, yes, but you must understand the nature of the man you are dealing with. Silas has built his empire on the silence of others. If he realizes that the silence has been broken, if he knows you hold these documents, he will not wait for a court of law to decide his fate. He will treat this as a war of attrition." The lawyer leaned forward, his gaze shifting between Elara and the Earl with a warning that needed no further explanation. "You must be cautious. Silas Thorne is returning here at the first of the month with his surveyors and a bailiff. He believes he is arriving to raise a ruin and reclaim what he thinks is his. If he finds that the ruin has teeth, he will strike with a ferocity that the border rights cannot easily arrest. I will take copies of these documents back to my office for safekeeping, but the originals must remain hidden here. They are your only shield and your only weapon." As Finchley packed his briefcase, the atmosphere in the library shifted from the relief of discovery to the tension of an impending siege. The air grew heavy with the knowledge of the danger they now invited. He left as quietly as he had arrived, his small figure disappearing once more into the mist like a shadow retreating from the sun. Elara looked at Arthur, the silence between them thick with the unspoken weight of the lawyer's warning. They had found the secret buried inside, but the cost of keeping it was beginning to mount. The evening arrived with a heavy, oppressive stillness that felt like a held breath. The wind had died down entirely, leaving the woods around Castle Celyn shrouded in a silence that felt dangerous. Elara was in the library, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she applied a final layer of cedar oil to the leather of the true Oakhaven ledgers, the scent sharp and grounding. She had spent years mastering the art of self-erasure, and now that knowledge was her greatest defense. She worked by the light of a single candle, the rest of the room a cavern of lengthening shadows that seemed to dance in the corners. A sudden violent sound shattered the quiet, a harsh discordance in the peaceful night. It was the sound of iron strikes in a clanking stone, the unmistakable clang of a heavy hammer against the rusted locks of the main gates. Elara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Silas Thorne had not waited for the first of the month. He had arrived in the dead of night, driven by a predatory intuition that his empire was under threat and that the woman he had tried to erase was still breathing. "He is here," Arthur whispered, appearing at her side with the suddenness of a ghost. He took the candle from the desk and extinguished it, plunging the library into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight against her eyes. He brought men with him. I saw the lanterns from the gallery. Too many for a simple survey. They aren't here to document, Elara. They are here to take what they could not find in the public record, and to ensure that no one else ever finds it. The sound of the postern door being forced open echoed up through the throat of the castle, a long protesting groan of old wood followed by the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the stone. It was the same sound that had haunted Elara's final days at the Vance estate, the sound of an invasion she was powerless to stop. Silas's voice drifted up the stairs, stripped of its usual clinical detachment and replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fury that promised no mercy. "Search the library," Silas commanded, his words rebounding off the vaulted ceilings like stones thrown into a well. "The girl is here. I want every ledger, every scrap of paper that isn't nailed down. If she resists, remind her that she is a trespasser on my land and that I have the right to clear my property." Arthur gripped Elara's arm, his touch firm and steadying, his strength flowing into her. "The secret passages," he murmured, his voice barely a breath against her ear. "Martha showed me the mechanism behind the north shelving when I was a boy. The ancient stones of the house will protect us, Elara. But we must move now before they reach the landing." They gathered the lead casket and the silver-threaded volumes, the weight of the metal heavy and cold against Elara's chest. Arthur led her toward the far corner of the library, where a massive oak bookshelf reached toward the carved cedar ceiling. He reached into a hidden gap in the wainscoting and pulled a rusted iron lever. With a sound like a low, grinding sigh, a section of the shelving swung inward, revealing a narrow, dark passage smelling of ancient cedar and dry earth. They stepped inside just as the library doors were thrown open with a violent crash. From the narrow gap in the stonework, Elara watched as Silas Thorne stepped into the room, his lantern casting long, flickering shadows that danced like demons against the books she had painstakingly restored. He walked straight to the central desk, his hand sweeping the binding tools onto the floor with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the enclosed space. "She's been mending the wood," Silas hissed, his gaze raking over the polished mahogany with a look of pure disgust. "She's been nesting in the ruin like a common thief, trying to reclaim what she lost. Find the casket. It has to be here. My uncle's letters were specific. The perpetuity was anchored in this library, and I will not leave until I have it in my hands." Elara stood in the absolute darkness of the passage, her breath held so tight it made her chest ache with the pressure. She felt the vibration of Silas's boots through the stone, a rhythmic throb that felt like the pulse of his greed beating against the foundations of the castle. Beside her, Arthur stood like a statue of limestone, his body a silent barrier between her and the man who sought to destroy them. They were inches away from discovery, separated only by a wall of oak and the centuries-old silence of the castle's design. As Silas's men began to ransack the shelves, throwing volumes to the floor with a reckless disregard for their history and the labor she had spent on them, Elara closed her eyes. She thought of the familiar weight of her own invisibility. For years it had been her burden, the mark of her insignificance in a world that valued only gold and status. But here, in the hidden marrow of Castle Celyn, it was her salvation. She was the woman who comprehended the ancient architecture of the truth, and as she clutched the precious records to her chest, she realized that Silas Thorne could tear down every stone of the castle and still never find what mattered. The secret was no longer just buried in the ground. It was buried in her resilience and her refusal to be erased. They waited in the dark, the sounds of Silas's futile rage echoing through the library until the early hours of the morning. Each crash of a book, each muttered curse from her cousin, was a testament to the power of the silence she had mastered. The house held them in its cold stone embrace, a forgotten fortress protecting its own from the storm of the world outside. "Tell me, as you listen to the echoes of Silas's anger tonight, have you ever found that your greatest strength lies in the very things the world tried to use against you? Where in your life is there a secret passage that offers you safety when the world comes knocking with a hammer? From which corner of the world are you witnessing this final stand for justice tonight? Share your quiet sanctuary with me below." The fine grey dust of centuries did not settle for hours after Silas Thorne and his men finally departed the ruins of the library. It hung in the air, a suspension of golden motes caught in the first tentative rays of a dawn that felt both earned and weary. From behind the hidden oak paneling of the library's secret passage, Elara Vance watched the silence return to the room. It was not the hollow, abandoned silence she had found upon her arrival at Castle Celyn, but a bruised, but vibrating quiet, the sound of a house that had been ransacked but not defeated. Beside her, Arthur Penhaligon remained as still as the stone of the castle itself, his breathing a steady rhythmic reassurance against the cold of the corridor. He did not speak until the last echo of the carriage wheels had faded into the damp Welsh mist, and when he finally reached for the rusted iron lever to release them, his hand was as steady as a master mason's. The library was a scene of calculated desecration. Silas had not merely searched for the missing documents, he had attempted to strip the room of its dignity. Rare volumes lay face down in the dirt, their spines cracked like broken wings, and the mahogany desks were scarred by the impatient strike of lantern bases. Elara stepped over a fallen folio of Elizabethan poetry, her gaze fixed not on the destruction, but on the lead casket she still clutched to her chest. Her fingers were numb, the cold metal having leached the warmth from her skin, but she felt a fierce, burning clarity. Silas Thorne had looked for her in the shadows, but he had never truly seen her. He had seen a nuisance to be cleared away, a penniless girl who knew how to mend a book. He had never imagined that the quiet scholar who grasped the true mechanics of his empire was the very one who could dismantle his world with a single set of accounts. They did not waste time in the ruins of the library. By midday, with Martha Halloway standing watch at the postern door, Elara and Arthur were seated in the back of a weathered, inconspicuous farm cart, their faces obscured by the shadows of travel-worn hoods. The journey to the local town of Monmouth was a grueling exercise in suppressed tension. Every rattle of the wheels against the limestone road felt like a summons, every passing traveller a potential spy in Silas's employ. Elara kept her hand inside her cloak, her fingers resting upon the ancient ledgers. The tactile reality of the parchment, the slight, oily texture of the ink and the crisp resistance of the vellum, was her only anchor in a world that felt as fragile as a spider's web in a gale. The magistrate's office was a room of clinical social coldness. It smelled of cheap snuff, damp wool, and the metallic tang of old inkwells. The magistrate, a man of high collars and low patience, sat behind a desk of scarred oak that looked like it had been used to adjudicate a century of petty miseries. He flicked his gaze between the disheveled woman before him and the scarred Earl of Oakhaven who stood at her shoulder. Silas Thorne was already there, leaning against the hearth with an air of practiced, aristocratic boredom. His frock coat was perfectly brushed, and his expression was one of paternal disappointment. "I find this meeting highly irregular," Silas said, his voice a dry, elegant rasp that carried no trace of the violence he had visited upon the castle the night before. "My cousin has been wandering the border for weeks, suffering from a clear distress of the mind following her father's unfortunate deaths. To have her appear here, encouraged by a man who has neglected his own duties for a decade, is a circus I had hoped to spare this court." Benjamin Finchley stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway, his leather briefcase appearing like a shield in the dim light of the hall. The lawyer did not look at Silas, he looked only at the magistrate. "The law does not concern itself with circuses, Mr. Thorne. It concerns itself with deeds, tithes, and the undeniable precision of a ledger. I have here a series of documents recovered from the foundation of Castle Celyn, documents that have been suppressed for 18 years. The room fell into the sudden, biting stillness of a tomb as Benjamin Finchley began to unroll the royal land grant. The wax seal, heavy and dark, looked like a drop of dried blood against the cream-colored vellum. Elara stepped forward then, her voice clear and stripped of any tremor. She did not look for Silas's reaction. She looked at the ledger she held. "You spoke of debt, Silas. You spoke of a grandfather who died in penury and a father who squandered the Vance inheritance on manuscripts. But the genuine financial records tell a different story. They tell of a systemic double-entry fraud that began in the spring of 1801. She began to read, her voice possessing the rhythmic, meditative pace of her manual labor at the bindery. She detailed the annuities that had been paid but never recorded, the double tithes extracted from the border tenants, and the specific forgery of her father's codicil. As she spoke, the technical details of the ledger, the exact percentages of interest, the hidden entries, and the silver-threaded accounts, built a wall around Silas Thorne that he could not climb. The magistrate leaned forward, his clinical boredom replaced by a sharp, legal fascination. He reached for his magnifying glass, his fingers tracing the signatures that Silas had believed were lost to time, Silas did not shout. He was a man of the Regency, and he understood the finality of a well-placed document. He watched as Benjamin Finchley presented the letter from Elara's father, the ink identifying the forger who had worked in Silas's London office. The arrogance in Silas's posture began to erode, his lean frame appearing suddenly skeletal and brittle. He looked at Elara, and for the first time in her life, she saw that he truly saw her. He did not see a ghost. He saw the woman who had mended the roof and mended the truth. He saw the steward of the legacy he had tried to burn. "Take him," the magistrate said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was not a grand declaration of justice. It was a clinical settlement of an account. 2 bailiffs stepped forward, their heavy hands falling upon Silas's shoulders. The sound of the iron manacles clicking shut was a small, decisive noise, but it echoed in the room like the turning of a heavy key in a lock that had been rusted shut for a generation. Silas Thorne was led away in a silence that was colder than the Welsh rain, his empire of lies having collapsed beneath the weight of a single, lead-lined casket. The return to Castle Celyn was a quiet, contemplative journey. The carriage wheels did not rattle this time, they seemed to hum against the stone. When they arrived at the gates, Martha Halloway was there, her sharp eyes scanning their faces for the verdict. The former housekeeper did not need to ask. She saw the way Elara held her head and the way Arthur walked, not like a ghost, but like a man who had finally stepped back into the light. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, amber shadows across the ivy-choked walls of the fortress. They climbed the spiraling stairs to the battlements, the wind from the border tasting of salt and distant pine. Elara stood between Arthur and Martha, her hands resting upon the rough, grit-covered limestone of the parapet. The castle did not feel like a ruin anymore. It felt like a body that had been mended, its bones reset and its breath restored. Below them, the woods were a sea of deep, quiet green, and the village in the valley was beginning to light its evening fires. "It is yours now, Elara," Arthur said softly, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the grey of the mountains met the rose of the sky. He did not look at her as a protector, but as a peer. "The perpetuity is secured. The Vance estate will be restored to you by the next sitting of the court, but Castle Celyn, it will always be the cornerstone of the thing. You found the secret, but you also found the endurance." Elara looked at her hands. They were scarred, ink-stained, and calloused. They were the hands of a woman who had mended a roof, braced a foundation, and pried the truth from the earth. She realized then that her long years of enforced invisibility had been a cocoon, a place where she had built the strength to become visible. She was no longer a woman with nowhere left to go. She was the mistress of a forgotten castle, and she was the keeper of a legacy that was no longer a burden, but a shield. "I think I should like to finish binding the library books first," Elara murmured, a quiet smile touching her lips. "The history of this place deserves to be held in leather and linen, not dust and shadow, and the roof. I think I noticed a loose shingle on the north tower that needs my attention." Martha gave a dry, hacking laugh, her cane tapping a rhythmic beat on the stone. "The girl will never be finished mending, my lord. Once you start hearing the pulse of the place, you can't ever stop." Arthur Penhaligon reached out, his hand covering Elara's on the cold stone. It was a soft, whispered promise of safety, a gesture that signified a resolution that required no further words. They stood together in the blue hour, the silence of the castle now a warm, protective embrace. The stones beneath their feet were ancient, but they were firm. From the ruins, she had built not just a future, but a home that could never be taken by a man with a hammer or a ledger of lies. She had spent her early years learning how to exist as a mere shadow, and now, as the stars began to appear over the Welsh border, she stood in the ordinary light, finally witnessed. Castle Celyn was no longer a forgotten fortress. It was a sanctuary built by her own hands, and the secret buried inside was no longer a ghost, but the foundation of her soul. "Tell me, as you listen to the final echo of this journey tonight, have you ever found that the greatest shelter is the one you build from the stones the world discarded? Where is the sanctuary in your life that finally feels safe? From which corner of the world are you listening to this quiet triumph of the spirit tonight? Share your peace with me below.